and Day's the mail-order marksman. The men in Stalag 7 called it the toy gun. When Private Eddie Kowalski first arrived at the Bavarian prisoner of war camp in February 1944, clutching his confiscated Springfield Rifles documentation papers like a shield, the other Americans barely looked up from their poker game. The rifle itself had been seized at capture naturally, but Eddie kept talking about it to anyone who would listen. How he'd ordered it from a Montgomery Ward catalog for $37.50, how he'd modified the trigger mechanism with parts from his uncle's machine shop in Detroit, how the German soldiers who captured him had laughed at the scratched stock and homemade adjustments. The snow crunched beneath his worn boots as he crossed the muddy yard for the first time, the alpine air sharp with the scent of wood smoke and cabbage soup. The barracks stretched before him in orderly rows, their wooden walls weathered grey against Bavaria's rolling hills. Guard towers punctuated the perimeter like exclamation marks, each one manned by Wehrmacht soldiers who seemed barely older than schoolboys. "Mail-order cowboy," muttered Sergeant Frank Morrison, the ranking NCO in their barracks. Morrison had been shot down over Schweinfurt 6 months earlier, his Flying Fortress crew scattered across different camps. He'd seen plenty of new prisoners arrive with their stories and their pride still intact. The camp had a way of wearing both down to nothing. Kid thinks he's Annie Oakley because he bought a rifle from a catalogue. The other prisoners snickered, but Eddie didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he folded the rifle documentation carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket. Back home in Detroit's Polish neighborhood, his grandfather had taught him that a man's worth wasn't measured by what others thought of his tools, but by what he could accomplish with them. But Eddie Kowalski wasn't like the other new prisoners. While most men spent their first weeks in stunned silence or desperate planning for impossible escapes, Eddie seemed to be studying everything. The guard rotations, the sight lines from the watchtowers, the daily routines of the German personnel. He noticed which guards spoke English, which ones looked homesick, and which ones treated the prisoners like human beings rather than livestock. He made friends with Josef, the elderly Austrian guard who spoke broken English and seemed almost apologetic about the war. Josef had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and a habit of sharing cigarettes when the Unterscharführer wasn't watching. During evening rounds, he would sometimes pause at Eddie's bunk to practice his English, speaking in careful whispers about his farm in the Tyrol. Eddie also traded cigarettes with Hans, the young Wehrmacht corporal who brought their meager rations and who confessed in whispered German that Eddie somehow understood that he had cousins in Milwaukee. Hans was barely 19, with hands that still looked more comfortable holding books than rifles. What nobody knew, not Morrison, not the other prisoners, not even the German commandant who reviewed Eddie's file, was that Private Kowalski had grown up in Detroit's Polish neighborhood where half the old men had fought in the trenches of World War I and the other half had fled the Kaiser's armies. His grandfather, Stefan, had escaped the chaos of the Eastern Front in 1917, carrying nothing but a battered rifle and stories of mud-soaked battlefields where boys died for causes they barely understood. Eddie had learned to shoot on his grandfather's farm outside the city, plinking cans and hunting rabbits with a rifle older than the century. Stefan had been patient but demanding, teaching him that marksmanship wasn't about the weapon. It was about breath control, sight picture, and the steady patience of a man who understood that every shot mattered. By the time he was 16, Eddie could put 5 shots into a silver dollar at 200 yards. The Montgomery Ward Springfield hadn't made him a marksman. It had simply given him a tool worthy of skills he'd spent years developing in silence. The morning roll call echoed across the compound at 0600 hours sharp, prisoners lining up in their threadbare uniforms while German voices barked commands in the crisp mountain air. Eddie found himself studying the guards' faces, noting how some looked directly at the prisoners while others stared over their heads, as if acknowledging their humanity might crack something fundamental in their training. During his first meal in the mess hall, Eddie noticed something that made him pause. The soup was thin, barely more than water with fragments of turnip floating like pale ghosts, but it was served in clean bowls. The German cook, a heavy-set man with flour on his apron, ladled each portion with mechanical precision, but his eyes lingered on the youngest prisoners. When a 19-year-old tail gunner from Nebraska started coughing, the cook added an extra ladle without comment. That night, lying on his straw mattress in the crowded barracks, Eddie fingered the rifle documentation papers in his pocket. $37.50 had seemed like a fortune when he'd saved up for it, working double shifts at his uncle's machine shop. Now it represented something else entirely, a connection to a world where a man could choose his own tools, modify them according to his needs, and take pride in craftsmanship rather than destruction. Morrison's voice cut through the darkness from the next bunk. "You'll learn, kid. This place changes you. Best thing you can do is forget about home and focus on staying alive." But Eddie wasn't convinced that forgetting was the answer. Around him, 43 other American airmen shifted in their bunks, each carrying their own stories of capture, their own memories of the moment everything changed. Outside, he could hear the measured footsteps of the guard patrol, Yosef's distinctive, slower gait, recognizable even in the darkness. The questions that would haunt him for the next 14 months were already forming. What did it mean when your enemy showed kindness? When the propaganda you'd believed met the reality you could see with your own eyes? And what would he tell people back home about guards who shared cigarettes and cooks who ladled extra soup for sick prisoners? If stories like this make you question what you do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp. And stay with us for the next chapters. How do you prepare for the moment when everything you've been taught about your enemy turns out to be only half the truth? March brought the first hints of spring to the Bavarian countryside, but inside Stalag 7A, winter seemed to linger in the bones of the prisoners. Eddie had been in the camp for 3 weeks, long enough to learn the rhythms that governed their days: morning roll call at dawn, work details assigned by noon, evening meal when the alpine shadows stretched long across the compound. The routine was designed to wear them down, but Eddie found himself adapting in ways that surprised Morrison and the other veteran prisoners. While they focused on maintaining military discipline and planning escapes that everyone knew were impossible, Eddie spent his time learning German phrases from Hans and understanding the subtle hierarchies among the guards. He discovered that Joseph wasn't just any ordinary guard. He was a reservist, called up at age 52 from his farm in Austria's Tyrol region. Joseph had fought in the last war as a teenager, knew what it meant to be cold and hungry and far from home. During their quiet conversations at evening inspection, Joseph would sometimes mention his 3 sons, 2 serving on the Russian front, 1 already buried in Ukraine's frozen soil. Krieg macht alte Männer aus Jungen, Joseph said one evening, his weathered hands checking Eddie's bunk with perfunctory thoroughness. War makes old men out of boys. Eddie nodded, understanding more German than he let on. His grandfather, Stefan, had used similar phrases, remnants of a polyglot childhood on the Polish-German border before the maps were redrawn yet again. The work details revealed another layer of complexity. Eddie volunteered for camp maintenance duty, despite Morrison's warnings that volunteers usually drew the worst assignments. The work was supervised by Unterscharführer Klaus Weber, a brutal career soldier who seemed to view prisoner abuse as a personal hobby. But it also brought Eddie into contact with the camp's daily operations. He learned that the Germans were struggling with supply shortages just like everyone else. The guards' uniforms showed careful mending, their boots were resoled with mismatched leather, and their rations weren't significantly better than what the prisoners received. Hans confided that his unit hadn't received new equipment in 4 months, and that several guards were veterans invalided back from the Russian front. "Meine cousins leben in Milwaukee," Hans whispered during one food distribution, his eyes darting nervously toward Weber's position. "My cousins live in Milwaukee." He'd been practicing this phrase for weeks, waiting for the right moment to share it with an American. The revelation created a strange moment of recognition. Eddie's own family had relatives scattered across Eastern Europe, people he'd never met but who shared his grandfather's stories of displacement and reinvention. The idea that this young German corporal might have family in Wisconsin, might have grown up hearing stories about American cousins the same way Eddie had heard stories about Polish villages, seemed impossible and inevitable at the same time. The most unsettling discovery came during his third week, when Eddie witnessed an interaction that didn't fit any of the propaganda narratives he'd carried into captivity. A prisoner in the next barracks had developed pneumonia, and the camp medical officer, Hauptmann Dietrich, actually requested additional blankets and medicine from his superiors. When the supplies were denied, Dietrich quietly arranged for the sick prisoner to be assigned to indoor work details until he recovered. Morrison noticed Eddie's confusion. "Don't start thinking they're the good guys, kid. They're still the enemy. They put us in here." "I'm not saying they're good guys," Eddie replied. "I'm just trying to understand what kind of enemy they are." This distinction seemed lost on most of the other prisoners, who maintained their solidarity through shared hatred and rigid adherence to military protocol. But Eddie found himself caught between two truths. These men were indeed his enemies, responsible for shooting down his bomber and imprising him, but they were also individuals with their own fears, losses, and small acts of conscience. The contradiction deepened when he received his first letter from home. His mother wrote about rationing and blackouts in Detroit, about his uncle's machine shop being converted to produce aircraft parts, about neighbors who had lost sons in Italy and the Pacific. But she also included a newspaper clipping about German prisoners of war working on farms in Michigan, being treated fairly under the Geneva Convention. Eddie read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully. The war looked different from every angle. His mother worrying about enemy prisoners being treated humanely, while he sat in an enemy camp questioning his own assumptions about who deserved humanity. That night, Joseph stopped by his bunk during evening rounds. "Haben Sie Familie in Detroit? Do you have family in Detroit?" "Ja," Eddie answered. "Meine Mutter arbeitet in einer Fabrik." "Yes, my mother works in a factory." Joseph nodded gravely. "Meine Frau auch. Munitionsfabrik in Innsbruck." "My wife too. Ammunition factory in Innsbruck." The parallel was almost too precise to bear. Both their mothers on opposite sides of a global conflict, spending their days producing the instruments of war, probably worrying about sons who were now looking at each other across the divide of a prisoner of war camp. Eddie fingered the Montgomery Ward rifle documentation in his pocket, now soft with handling. $37.50 had bought him more than a rifle. It had bought him the belief that individual competence and American ingenuity could overcome any obstacle. But what did competence mean when your enemy turned out to be competent too? What did American ingenuity mean when your guards spoke wistfully about relatives in Milwaukee? The questions multiplied faster than answers, and Eddie was beginning to understand why Morrison preferred the simplicity of hatred. It was easier to carry. What happens when the enemy stops being abstract and starts having a mother who works in a factory, just like yours? The opportunity came on March 15th, during what the Germans called routine perimeter maintenance. Eddie had been in Stalag 7A for 6 weeks, long enough to understand that spring brought both hope and restlessness to the compound. The snow was melting in the Bavarian countryside, revealing patches of earth that reminded everyone of home and freedom. A work detail of 20 prisoners had been assigned to repair the barbed wire fence along the camp's eastern boundary, where recent storms had damaged several sections. Eddie volunteered immediately, despite Morrison's warning that volunteers usually drew the worst assignments. The work was supervised by only 3 guards, Josef, Hans, and the brutal Unterscharführer Klaus Weber, who seemed to view prisoner abuse as a personal hobby. Weber was different from the other guards, a career soldier who'd been stationed at Stalag 7 since its establishment. While Josef and Hans treated the prisoners with distant professionalism, Weber seemed to take personal pleasure in the small humiliations that made up daily life in the camp. He confiscated extra food, reported minor infractions for punishment, and maintained a running commentary about American gangsters and their inevitable defeat. The work itself was straightforward, replacing damaged wire, resetting fence posts, and clearing debris from the winter storms. But Eddie noticed something that the other prisoners missed. Weber had developed predictable patterns in his supervision. He positioned himself on a wooden crate for better visibility, always facing toward the main compound where he could be seen by his superiors. Most importantly, he became distracted whenever aircraft appeared on the horizon. At 2:17 in the afternoon, Weber made his fatal mistake. A group of American P-51 Mustangs appeared on the horizon, heading northeast toward what looked like a bombing run on Munich. Weber, excited by the sight of potential American losses, climbed onto his improvised observation post to get a better view, shouting in German about gangster flyers getting what they deserved. Eddie had been waiting for this moment, studying Weber's habits for 6 weeks. He'd noticed that the Unterscharführer kept his Luger in an unsecured holster, had observed that he always turned his back when aircraft appeared, had calculated the exact distance between the woodpile and Weber's observation post. When Weber climbed up to watch the planes, Eddie moved with the fluid precision of someone who had been planning this moment for weeks. What happened next took less than 4 seconds. The Luger was in Eddie's hand before Weber realized what was happening. Josef and Hans, startled by Weber's sudden cry, turned to find themselves facing a prisoner who held their supervisor's weapon with the casual confidence of a man born to it. "Tell them to drop their rifles," Eddie said quietly to Josef in surprisingly clear German. "Tell them that nobody has to die today, but that depends entirely on what happens in the next 30 seconds. Josef, his weathered face pale with shock, translated frantically. Hans, barely 18 and clearly terrified, immediately let his carabiner 98K fall to the ground. Josef hesitated for a moment longer, his eyes moving between Eddie's steady grip on the Luger and Weber, who was now face down in the dirt with his hands behind his head. The other prisoners on the work detail, initially frozen with terror at the sight of an escape attempt that would surely result in mass executions, slowly realized that Eddie wasn't trying to escape at all. He was conducting a lesson. What followed became legend in Stalag 7A, though the full story wouldn't emerge until years after the war ended. Eddie had planned not just the capture of 3 guards, but an entire tactical operation that demonstrated every principle of marksmanship, fieldcraft, and psychological warfare that had been mocked as mail-order nonsense just weeks earlier. With Weber's Luger, Hans's rifle, and Joseph's weapon now under his control, Eddie began demonstrating exactly what an expert marksman could accomplish with proper equipment and tactical positioning. The camp's main watchtower stood 300 yards away, an impossible shot with a pistol, a challenging one with a rifle, and absolutely forbidden under any circumstances for a prisoner of war. Eddie handed Hans's carabiner to Morrison, who had been watching the entire scene with growing amazement. "You said I was a mail-order cowboy," Eddie said calmly. "Let's see what a mail-order rifle can actually do." The first shot took out the spotlight on the main tower. The second shattered the searchlight on the northern perimeter. The third and fourth disabled the communication lines that connected the guard posts to the commandant's office. Eddie was using a captured German rifle to demonstrate principles of precision shooting that most of the German guards had never seen, even in training. But the real lesson wasn't in marksmanship, it was in psychological warfare. Eddie never fired a shot that endangered human life. Every target was equipment, infrastructure, or symbolic authority. When German reinforcements arrived from the main compound, they found a work detail that had somehow transformed into a tactical demonstration, conducted by a prisoner who had seized control of the situation without killing anyone or attempting to escape. For 3 hours and 26 minutes, Eddie maintained complete control of the perimeter section. He demonstrated advanced military tactics to an audience of increasingly respectful fellow prisoners and genuinely terrified German guards. But more importantly, he established a new dynamic between captor and captive, a recognition that respect was earned through competence, not rank. The standoff lasted until 5:43 that afternoon, when Commandant Oberst Heinrich Brenner finally arrived with a full squad of Wehrmacht soldiers. Eddie carefully placed the weapons on the ground and stepped back with his hands raised. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding about my qualifications," he told the commandant in perfect German. "Perhaps we could discuss appropriate work assignments for prisoners with specialized skills. Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward. And share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. When does proving your competence become more important than following orders?" The next 24 hours changed everything about Stalag 7 Days' internal dynamics. Word of Eddie's demonstration spread through the barracks faster than news of Red Cross packages. The prisoner, who had been dismissed as a mail-order cowboy, had just conducted a masterclass in tactical control using weapons he'd never touched before that day. More importantly, he had done it without killing anyone, without attempting escape, and without giving the Germans any legal justification for the mass reprisals that usually followed prisoner uprisings. Morrison found Eddie in the punishment barracks that evening, expecting to find a broken man facing execution or transfer to a death camp. Instead, he found Eddie calmly playing chess with Joseph, who had requested assignment as the punishment block's guard. The elderly Austrian was asking detailed questions about American farming techniques, while Eddie patiently explained crop rotation patterns between chess moves. "How did you know?" Morrison asked, his voice carrying 6 months of accumulated respect for camp authority. "How did you know they wouldn't just shoot all of us?" Eddie moved his knight and looked up with a slight smile. "Same way I knew that rifle was worth 37.50, Sergeant. Sometimes you've got to look past what other people think they see." The chess set was crude, pieces carved from wood scraps and painted with makeshift dyes, but it represented something profound about the relationship developing between Eddie and Joseph. Here was an American prisoner and an Austrian guard finding common ground in a game that required thinking several moves ahead, planning strategies that accounted for your opponent's intelligence rather than dismissing it. Joseph's English had improved dramatically during their conversations. In my village," he said carefully, "we have saying, der klügste Mann ist der weiß, dass nichts weiß. The wisest man is he who knows that he knows nothing." Eddie understood the philosophical challenge. His demonstration hadn't been about superior American training or inherent competence. It had been about recognizing that his captors were individuals with their own skills, fears, and capacity for reason. Weber was brutal because he chose to be, not because all Germans were programmed for cruelty. The changes began immediately. Eddie was transferred from general labor to camp maintenance, a position that, while still technically punishment, gave him access to tools, equipment, and information that proved invaluable to prisoner morale and covert resistance efforts. His demonstrated expertise with weapons and tactics made him an informal advisor to escape committees and intelligence-gathering operations. But the most significant change was in the behavior of the German guards themselves. More of them began requesting assignment to sections where Eddie worked. They came initially out of curiosity about the prisoner who had outshot their training instructors with weapons he'd never used before. They stayed because Eddie treated them as individuals rather than enemies. Hans approached him during the 3rd week after the demonstration, his young face serious with concentration. "Mine cousins in Milwaukee," he said haltingly, then switched to English. "They write letters, say America very big, very different from what we learn." Eddie nodded. "What did you learn?" "That Americans are, soft, that you cannot fight like real soldiers. But you fight with Kopf, with head, very smart fighting." This conversation, seemingly casual and conducted in full view of camp authorities, became part of an informal intelligence pipeline that benefited prisoners throughout the camp system. Eddie shared stories about American industrial techniques, farming innovations, and the immigrant communities that had built Detroit's manufacturing might. In return, he learned about German equipment shortages, morale problems on the Eastern Front, and the growing war weariness among even the most dedicated Wehrmacht units. The revelation that troubled him most came from Josef during one of their evening chess games. The Austrian guard had been holding a letter from his wife, reading and rereading it with the careful attention of a man who knew each word might be the last he'd receive. "Meine Frau schreibt," Josef said quietly, "dass amerikanische Gefangene in Österreich gut behandelt werden. My wife writes that American prisoners in Austria are being treated well." Eddie paused with his bishop halfway to its destination. "Your wife works with American prisoners?" Nein. "No, but in her munitions factory they have American Kriegsgefangene working. She says they are given good food, medical care. She worries about my sons on Russian front, hopes Russians treat them same way." The moral arithmetic was staggering. Joseph's wife was supervising American prisoners who were probably being treated according to Geneva Convention standards, while Joseph himself was guarding American prisoners under similar conditions, and both of them worried about Joseph's sons, who might become prisoners themselves on the Eastern Front, where such niceties were rarely observed. Eddie fingered the Montgomery Ward documentation in his pocket, now worn soft from handling. "Joseph, can I ask you something?" "Ja, natürlich." "Yes, of course. Why did you request punishment detail duty?" Joseph was quiet for a long moment, studying the chessboard. "Because you show me something. When you take Weber's pistol, you could kill him. Easy. You could kill Hans, kill me, but you choose not to kill. This is very difficult choice in war." Eddie had never thought of mercy as a difficult choice. In the propaganda films and training lectures, American values were presented as natural, inevitable responses to conflict. But Joseph was right. Choosing not to kill when you had the power to kill was much harder than following orders that simplified moral decisions. That night, lying in his punishment cell, Eddie tried to compose a letter to his mother. How could he explain that his German guards were treating him fairly, that some of them had family in America, that the enemy was turning out to be more complex than anyone had prepared him to understand? He thought about Morrison's warning about the camp-changing people and realized that the change wasn't weakness or collaboration. It was the uncomfortable growth that came from discovering that the world was more complicated than the stories you'd been told about it. How do you write home about an enemy who plays chess with you and worries about his own sons becoming prisoners? By June 1944, when Allied armies landed in Normandy, Eddie Kowalski had become the most respected prisoner in Stalag 70A, not just among the Americans, but among the German guards who had initially laughed at his mail-order rifle story. His barracks had become an informal center for technical education, where prisoners shared manufacturing knowledge, engineering expertise, and practical skills that kept morale high during the darkest periods of captivity. The secret that would redefine everything Eddie thought he knew about his situation revealed itself during a conversation with Hauptmann Dietrich, the camp medical officer. Eddie had been assigned to help repair the infirmary's heating system, a complex task that required both mechanical knowledge and careful coordination with German authorities. Dietrich was a different kind of German officer, older, more thoughtful, with the careful precision of a man who had spent years saving lives rather than taking them. He watched Eddie work with the heating pipes, noting the methodical approach that reflected genuine engineering training. "Sie sind nicht nur Soldat," Dietrich observed. "You are not just a soldier." Eddie paused in his work, wrench balanced in his hand. "No, sir. I worked in my uncle's machine shop before the war. Learned a lot about mechanical systems." "Interessant?" "Interesting." Dietrich pulled out a folder from his desk, one that Eddie recognized as his prisoner file. "According to this, you are listed as unskilled laborer, minimal education. But I have been watching your work for 3 months. You understand engineering principles that most university students do not grasp." The revelation hit Eddie like a physical blow. His file, the document that determined his work assignments, his treatment, even his basic conditions, was deliberately falsified. Someone had classified him as unskilled labor to ensure he would be assigned to the most difficult and degrading work details. Wer hat diese Einstufung vorgenommen? Who made this classification? Dietrich hesitated, then seemed to reach a decision. Unterscharführer Weber. Klassifiziert alle amerikanischen Gefangenen als ungelernte Arbeiter. Unterscharführer Weber. He classifies all American prisoners as unskilled workers. Glaubt, dass dies, wie sagt man, ihre Moral bricht. He believes this, how do you say, breaks their morale. The systematic nature of the deception was staggering. Weber hadn't just been cruel to individual prisoners. He had been deliberately undermining the Geneva Convention's requirements for appropriate work assignments based on prisoners' actual skills and education. Eddie's mechanical expertise, Morrison's navigation training, the radio operator's technical knowledge, all of it had been ignored in favor of assignments designed to humiliate and demoralize. But Dietrich wasn't finished. Nach Ihrer Demonstration. Letzte Woche habe ich eine neue Klassifizierung beantragt. After your demonstration last week, I requested a new classification. Sie werden als technischer Spezialist eingestuft. Angemessene Arbeit, bessere Bedingungen. You will be classified as technical specialist. Appropriate work, better conditions. Eddie set down his wrench carefully. Why are you telling me this? Dietrich was quiet for a moment, staring at the medical chart scattered across his desk. Mein Sohn ist Kriegsgefangener in England, he said finally. My son is a prisoner of war in England. Ich hoffe, dass jemand dort ihn mit Respekt behandelt. I hope that someone there treats him with respect. The Montgomery Ward rifle documentation suddenly took on new significance. Eddie pulled the worn papers from his pocket, smoothing them on Dietrich's desk. $37.50, but more than that, it represented a young man's ambition to improve himself, to take responsibility for his own competence, rather than relying on what others provided. Das ist interessant, Dietrich murmured, examining the documentation. This is interesting. Sie haben Ihr eigenes Gewehr gekauft? Modifikationen selbst vorgenommen? You bought your own rifle? Made modifications yourself? Yes, sir. The standard issue was adequate. But I wanted something I could rely on completely. Dietrich nodded slowly. Das erklärt vieles. This explains much. Weber sieht selbstständiges Denken als Bedrohung. Weber sees independent thinking as a threat. Aber ich sehe es als was Amerika stark macht. But I see it as what makes America strong. That evening, Eddie found himself back in his regular barracks for the first time since the demonstration. Morrison and the other prisoners gathered around as he explained what Dietrich had revealed about their classification system. They've been deliberately misclassifying us, Eddie said. Not just me, all of us. Radio operators listed as farm laborers, navigators as general workers, engineers as unskilled labor. Morrison's face went through several expressions before settling on grim understanding. Son of a bitch wanted to break us down systematically. But here's the thing, Eddie continued. Dietrich knows it's wrong. Joseph knows it. Hans knows it. Even some of the other guards know it. Weber's been operating outside normal procedures. The implications rippled through the group. Their treatment hadn't reflected standard German policy. It had reflected one man's interpretation of how to break American morale. Some of their captors had been trying to treat them fairly within a system that Weber had corrupted. Eddie pulled out the rifle documentation again, now understanding its full symbolic weight. This piece of paper proves something Weber couldn't stand, that an ordinary American kid could save up his money, buy quality equipment, and make it better through his own effort. Morrison studied the worn documents. $37.50. That was a lot of money for a kid. Took me 8 months of extra shifts to save up for it. But it was worth it because it was mine. I understood every part of it, every modification. When they laughed at my toy gun, they were really laughing at the idea that individual competence could matter more than official approval. That night, as Eddie lay in his regular bunk for the first time in weeks, he thought about the moral complexity that Dietrich's revelation had created. Some of his captors had been trying to treat him fairly. Some had been actively working against Weber's systematic cruelty. The enemy wasn't monolithic. It was a collection of individuals making individual choices about how to exercise their authority. The rifle documentation rustled in his pocket as he shifted position. $37.50, but also the proof that dignity and competence could survive even systematic attempts to destroy them. What do you do when you discover that the injustice you've suffered came not from your enemy's nature, but from one cruel man's choice to ignore his own side's rules? The war ended for Stalag 7A on April 29, 1945, when elements of the U.S. 7th Army liberated the camp. Among the liberated prisoners was Private Eddie Kowalski, who had spent 14 months demonstrating that expertise comes from knowledge and practice, not from expensive equipment or official credentials. His Montgomery Ward catalog rifle had been lost in the chaos of capture, but the skills it had helped him develop had sustained an entire community through the worst period of their lives. The liberation came with a complexity that none of the propaganda films had prepared them for. American tanks rolled through the main gate, while German guards like Joseph and Hans laid down their weapons with obvious relief. Weber had disappeared 3 days earlier, fleeing south toward the Swiss border, as rumors of the advancing Allied armies reached the camp. Eddie found Joseph in the commandant's office, methodically destroying records that might implicate guards who had shown kindness to prisoners. The elderly Austrian looked up with tired eyes as Eddie approached. "Sie brauchen das nicht zu tun," Eddie said quietly. "You don't need to do that." Joseph paused in his work, a half-burned document in his weathered hands. "Ich weiß nicht, was mit uns geschehen wird," he replied. "I don't know what will happen to us." "I'll tell them," Eddie said, switching to English. "I'll tell them about the chess games, about the extra blankets, about the way you treated us like human beings." Joseph smiled sadly. "Sie sind ein guter Mensch, Eddie Kowalski. Ich hoffe, Sie vergessen nicht, dass nicht alle Deutsche sind wie Weber." "You are a good man, Eddie Kowalski. I hope you don't forget that not all Germans are like Weber." Joseph, the Austrian guard who had become an unlikely friend, was among the German personnel processed by Allied intelligence. His testimony about prisoner treatment at Stalag 7A helped establish Eddie's case for recognition of his resistance activities. More importantly, Joseph's detailed accounts of Eddie's technical knowledge and leadership abilities found their way into post-war assessments of prisoner resilience and morale factors in German camps. But the real complexity came during Eddie's debriefing with U.S. Army intelligence officers. They wanted clear narratives, heroes and villains, American resourcefulness triumphing over German brutality. Eddie's story of guards who shared cigarettes and played chess didn't fit the required categories. "So you're saying some of these guards treated you well?" Lieutenant Colonel Harrison asked, his pen poised over a standard debriefing form. Yes, sir, some of them. And you developed friendships with enemy personnel. Eddie hesitated. The word friendship seemed both too small and too dangerous for what he'd experienced with Joseph. I developed respect for individuals who treated us with dignity, sir. Private Kowalski, you understand that fraternization with the enemy is a serious charge. I understand that treating people like human beings shouldn't be a serious charge, sir. The interview ended with Eddie classified as a complex case requiring further evaluation. His heroic demonstration with captured German weapons was officially commended, but his excessive sympathy for enemy personnel was noted as requiring continued observation. Morrison, whose own liberation interviews had been more straightforward, found Eddie sitting alone in the displaced persons camp 3 days later. "They giving you trouble about Joseph and the others?" "They want me to say they were all monsters," Eddie replied. "But they weren't. Some of them were just people, trying to do their jobs without being monsters. That's a hard thing to explain to folks back home." Eddie pulled out the Montgomery Ward rifle documentation, now so worn it was nearly transparent. "Sergeant, what do you think this piece of paper really means?" Morrison studied it for a moment. 3750 for a rifle, kid who wanted to be prepared. "I think it means something else now. I think it means that sometimes the most important battles aren't against the enemy in front of you. Sometimes they're against the assumption that having an enemy means you have to stop seeing them as human." The ship ride home was the strangest part of the entire experience. Hundreds of liberated prisoners, all carrying stories they weren't sure how to tell. Eddie found himself avoiding conversations about his time in the camp, not because the memories were too painful, but because they were too complicated. 3 decades later, when Eddie Kowalski retired from his job as a quality control supervisor at Ford Motor Company, a package arrived at his Dearborn home with no return address. Inside was a carefully restored 1943 Springfield rifle, identical to the one he had ordered from Montgomery Ward before the war. The note, written in shaky English, explained that Joseph's grandson had spent 2 years tracking down Eddie's address. The old man had died peacefully in Austria, but not before making his grandson promise to find the American prisoner who had taught him that dignity could survive even in the darkest circumstances. Eddie held the rifle for a long time, feeling its familiar weight, remembering the pride he'd taken in those careful modifications so many years ago. But he also remembered Joseph's weathered hands moving chess pieces, Hans practicing English phrases, and Dietrich quietly fighting Weber's systematic cruelty. The rifle now hangs in a place of honor in the National Museum of World War II in New Orleans, donated by Eddie's family after his death in 1987. The placard tells the basic story: a prisoner of war who demonstrated remarkable marksmanship skills despite being equipped with what others considered inferior weapons. But the full story, preserved in oral histories collected from surviving Stalag 7A veterans, reveals something more profound about the nature of expertise, respect, and the small acts of courage that sustain hope in impossible situations. It's about a $37 rifle that taught a young man that individual competence mattered, and about the guards and prisoners who learned that treating enemies like human beings was harder than hatred, but infinitely more important. Eddie's final interview for the Oral History Project came just 6 months before his death. When asked what he remembered most clearly about his time in Stalag 7A, he was quiet for a long moment. "I remember the weight of that Luger in my hand, and knowing I could have killed Weber but choosing not to. I remember Joseph's English getting better every week because he wanted to understand us. I remember Hans talking about his cousins in Milwaukee. But mostly, I remember learning that the hardest enemy to defeat isn't the one pointing a rifle at you. It's the voice in your head that tells you the person pointing the rifle isn't really a person at all." The Montgomery Ward documentation, he said, had been about more than purchasing a rifle. It had been about a young man's faith that individual effort and competence could overcome any obstacle. The war had tested that faith, but not in the way he'd expected. The real test hadn't been whether American training could defeat German equipment. It had been whether American values could survive contact with German humanity. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. What stories do we choose not to tell because they complicate our understanding of who we're supposed to be?